Hi, I'm Len Rydell, Executive Director of the Blue and Gray Education Society, and I'd like to welcome you to another lecture in our Petersburg to Appomattox series, which was conducted in September of 1996. In the 25 years that have intervened between this talk and the time that I'm introducing it again, is that so much great scholarship has come forward. At the time, really about all we had that was readable was Andy Trudeau's 4-volume series on the Overland Campaign that then went on through Appomattox when he did a final version of that. But a lot of what was missing was a lot of the color and stuff. And while Andy was very informative and educational in what he had presented, nobody knew more about Petersburg than Chris Calkins. And as I've said, he had written several books which were part of a series. He was helping a friend who was a publisher, Harold Howard, but Howard didn't have extraordinarily high expectations, and so I don't think Chris was ever challenged to write as well as I'm sure he could have. And so his books were really relatively mechanical in presenting information here and there. And I've never really seen Chris with a book that was a definitive work. But like Al Hurt, there's honey in the horn. And while Chris may not have written really well or written a lot of bits and pieces we should have seen, nobody gave a better presentation. Nobody I ever saw was a better public historian than Chris Calkins. And I'm talking about a lot of guys, Terry Winchell, Bars, all these folks. I mean, Chris had it. He had the enthusiasm. He had everything that was necessary. He could make you feel it. And of course, he has so completely thrown himself into the process that that he knew this stuff like he knew the hairs on the back of his hand, and he knew how to present it. And people were always asking him to come in because he was a historian. He was always doing tours and stuff. And so his shtick got burnished further and further and further. Well, because he fully embraced the region and the city, he was restoring a house in Petersburg, a period house that had been used as as I recollect, a federal headquarters after the occupation. Chris wanted people to see the Petersburg that he loved and so forth. And historic Petersburg was a wonderful place, and there were lots and lots of stories of Petersburg. And so as part of this program, because Petersburg was under siege, just as Vicksburg was under siege and so forth, it's really important to tell you what life was like in Petersburg at the time. And so I asked if Chris would do that, and he was delighted to do so. And this lecture is that product, which he delivered before he then began to take us out and do Lee's Retreat and do the ride, which was Lee's Retreat. But this was the Petersburg he knew. Since then, Will Green has written a superb book on Petersburg. He's also written another book on breaking the backbone of the rebellion, and he has started a 2 or 3 volume detailed study of the Petersburg campaign that will be the definitive works. So Will Green will be the writer that covers Petersburg and everything else, but he got an awful lot of this at the feet of his good friend and colleague, Chris Calkins. So sit back, relax, and enjoy the master of Petersburg, Chris Calkins. The program that we've set up for you this evening is, as I told you yesterday, in trying to deal with the Petersburg campaign, not the quote siege unquote, but the campaign itself. There are so many things that you could deal with. As I mentioned before, we talked in terms of how do you really deal with all the battle actions, just from the level of detail which you got in Dr. Summers' very excellent presentation this morning. If you can take that and magnify so many of those actions by a factor of 6 or 7 or 8 or 9, I think you realize the impossibility of being able to deal with all those military types of actions. So we did in fact try to do what we could with that on the tours. With these lectures, what we have wanted to do is give you a little bit of a feel of the personality of the war, of the things, how this really ended up affecting folks, and what was the status of the belligerents at this stage of the war. Obviously, without any question, Union fortunes are up and Confederate fortunes are down. Little question of that. But there's even more to it than just that. We're going to examine that tonight. We're also going to talk about Petersburg, a city under siege, a city caught in the middle of an assembly of 160, 70, 80,000 people who are intent on destroying each other. And the people who are living in the periphery that are supporting this operation, who are experiencing this, who are on the receiving end of shells from the dictator and things such as this. How does this really work? Our speaker this evening, you already know. Chris Calkins is a nationally respected expert in all aspects of this campaign. He has some broad-based experience. He did, in fact, start as a historian at Spotsylvania, Fredericksburg, but has spent the bulk of his 25-year National Park Service career in the Appomattox, or in the Petersburg area. In doing so, he has authored a number of books and articles relative to this campaign, including an excellent co-authored book with Ed Bars on the Battle of Five Forks. More important than that, and I think something that all of us in an education environment can appreciate, is that I think Chris epitomizes the sort of gotta-do-it spirit that permeates the preservation and education movement that you've seen grow up over the last few years. He is a founding member of the Association for Preservation of Civil War Sites. Chris Calkins is the driving force behind the acquisition of Pamplin Park, which many of you visited today. He's the man that made that happen. As a recognition of that, he has been named the Preservationist of the Year in Petersburg twice by the city. He is also the architect of the Lee's Retreat driving tour, which is now finding many copycats, not just in the state of Virginia, but across the country. In Mississippi, they are contacting people in Virginia and Chris asking, how is this done? How is this working in terms of economic impact? The response to Lee's Retreat has been phenomenal. So what you have in Chris Calkins is you have a person whose total commitment and belief in the value of Civil War heritage and its ability to enrich all of us is actually engendered in everything that he does and how he works. And of course, without Sarah and her assistance, Chris is not able to do nearly half of what he does. And all of us who have been blessed like that certainly understand and appreciate the sacrifices that people like Sarah have made to allow Chris to pursue his profession that he loves so much. So I think you're in for a very special treat this evening as we start off with a discussion of Petersburg, a city under siege. Please join me in welcoming Chris Calkins.
Thank you, Glenn. It's the first time, I don't know how many thousands of speeches I've given, that I haven't been introduced as coming from Detroit. Like that means something. But actually, you did miss one thing. I actually did start at Appomattox, and that's where I met Sarah at, and 20 years ago, and well, actually 25 years ago, but we're going to be having our 20th anniversary in about 3 weeks. So she kind of is very special to me for that reason. Like Glenn said, we spent yesterday going over the battles, or at least a section of the battles. Tomorrow we're going to pick up and do some of the final engagements here at Petersburg. I want to take you out and show you where General A.P. Hill was killed. I know one of your members, he and I have corresponded over that situation. And we'll head on down. Hopefully, if we can get across Hatcher and Run, head on out White Oak Road, then do Five Forks, and then again, depending on the Creekstone Rise, go on to Appomattox. But tonight what I'd like to talk to you about is a little bit about what it was like in Petersburg during the war. First of all, did any of you go to the Siege Museum today? Uh-oh, you're going to hear something that a little in contrary to what you might have heard up there. You'll pick it up as I go along. But one thing, this little quote here that I have here, I wanted to throw in before we started talking about that. I think it kind of talks about this area and why I'm so interested in it. And really, one of the first books that I know that was ever done on this siege, Dick Summers did it. The only criticism I have of it was its title. It said, Richmond Redeemed, the Siege of Petersburg. And when I used to sell it at the Visitors Center, it was that thick, and everybody would buy it thinking it was the history of the siege. And you'd have to explain to them, no, it's just the Battle of People's Farm and Fort Harrison. But it's a wonderful book. I wish it was still in print. But anyways, some military writers have slighted the Petersburg campaign on the ground that the decision had been made and the campaign was anti-climax. If so, it was an anti-climax which occupied many of the ablest leaders of both sides. Thousands of men died to seal a fact which was by no means self-evident. Yet individual engagements which might have attracted greater attention in different settings did seem to lose their identities in what John Eston Cook called one long battle, day and night, week after week, month after month, during the heat of summer, the sad hours of autumn, and the cold nights and days of winter. Insofar as the campaign was a sitting down affair, wrote a Union officer, the bottom of the chairs were hard. Now, the people of Petersburg, well, I've had the pleasure of living with since 1981, are still pretty much as they were back at that time. I found a little comment from the Richmond newspaper in the 1860s. It said, "We suppose there is no place in Virginia where there is more true refinement, more genial social warmth, and less of the starched and stiff pretension which sometimes follows prosperity and wealth, and is always the mark of weak and vulgar minds, than in the city of Petersburg." In 1860, Petersburg was the 50th largest city in the country, 49th in manufacturing wealth, 7th largest city in the Confederacy, and the 3rd largest city in Virginia. It had a population of 18,266. Of that, 47% were black, and of that figure, 16% were free blacks. It's the largest free black population in the South at that time. Now, previous to the war, there had been a cosmic occurrence in the form of a comet, which many of those here in Petersburg thought was an omen of what was to come to this city, which was known incidentally as the Cockade City. It goes back to the War of 1812 when Petersburg militiamen wore a hat that had a cockade on it, and so they were called the Cockade City of the Union. Now, as the war broke, secessionist views were held by a minority of Petersburg citizens. In fact, they cast a vote in the state convention to remain with the Union. But of course, once Lincoln called for his volunteers, this changed the views of the city. Consequently, Petersburg would send into the Confederate service 11 infantry companies, 3 cavalry troops, and 3 artillery batteries. The city boasted that it sent more men to war than the total number of registered voters in the city. Now, much of the material that I'll be presenting to you tonight comes from 3 prominent chroniclers of that time. One of them is Charles Campbell, who was a bona fide historian of that time. He wrote a diary, and those of you who are history professors know that generally as a historians as a profession come after the war. Then there's Sarah Pryor. And if you went to the Siege Museum, much of what was used in there, the quotes and whatever, come from her book, which is called Reminiscences of War and Peace. Now, she was the wife of former General Roger Pryor of the Confederacy, who was taken out of command and then came back into service as a private in the 3rd Virginia Cavalry, and eventually was captured here at Petersburg. But she wrote this book, and find it interesting. He was a very rabid secessionist, if you're familiar with Roger Pryor. And after the war, he immediately went up to New York, and they lived up there, and poor Sarah Pryor would die by being run over by an automobile after having gone through this siege. And then the third individual whose information was also used in the Siege Museum was Dr. John Herbert Claiborne, who wrote a book called 75 Years in Old Virginia. Now, the first time that war really came home to those in Petersburg was in the spring of 1861, called Pawnee Sunday. This is when rumors ran through the streets of the city here that a Union gunboat by the name of Pawnee was reported coming up the Appomattox. This turned out not to be true, but some of the local batteries, artillery batteries in the area, went out to meet it, and of course it was all for naught. Now, the city of Petersburg is located on the fall line, the Appomattox River over here, and so it is titled up to that point. Consequently, it has a foreign port, or it had a foreign port at that time, with a custom house. And that custom house still survives today. It is now our city hall. It's a beautiful granite building. Early on, Petersburg served the Confederacy in many capacities. There was a gunpowder manufacturer here. There was a naval rope walk, which turned out cordage for the Confederate Navy. There was a smelting plant at the at the Confederate States Lead Works. Of course, then the lead was sent up to Richmond, where they had the Richmond Arsenal, and that was established in 1862. There was a repair shop for artillery and wagons. There was a copper and zinc works here. Of course, copper being needed for the percussion caps. Niter and Mining Bureau established niter beds here for potassium nitrate, an ingredient needed for black gunpowder. Directly across the river were two villages. One is called Matoka, the other is Ettrick, and they had the cotton mills. Cotton mills were there, and they operated to capacity during the war, producing tent cloth, sheets, and uniform materials. And the local ladies here in Petersburg were paid 2 cents for making grain sacks, 15 cents for a pair of drawers, and they had set up in a storefront in front of the courthouse, which, if you recall, yesterday was the building we saw with the clock tower and justice on it, the courthouse. And they produced thousands of shirts and trousers with a weekly payroll of over $1,000 in Confederate currency. And also along the Appomattox River were numerous flour mills, which produced for the Confederacy. Now, as far as public utilities, this is what this town had. One of these, which I showed you yesterday, which is right behind you here, is the gas plant, gas lighting. My house, which you saw yesterday, would have also had running water in it. And how that worked was, to the south of town is a high ground where they had a reservoir. And just using a gravity system, water came in there, so you had a municipal water system. Consequently, you would find fire hydrants along the streets. There were 4 volunteer fire companies, which had steam fire engines. There were street lamps, of course, gas operated. The streets were paved with cobblestone. I remember one person yesterday was asking about that. In the central business district, you would have brick sidewalks, and then you even had a well-run city government, the mayor and the city council. And I take these following items from the business directory of 1860 just to show you what you could buy here in Petersburg. You could buy cotton hair shuck mattresses for your house. putting them on Tolman's patent self-ventilating spring mattresses. You could buy paper curtains for your house, floor and table oilcloths, water coolers, bathtubs, refrigerators, stoves and ranges. You could even heat your house with hot air furnaces. There was a fine art gallery here in Petersburg. You had the Virginia Quick Step. They sold Virginia diarrhea medicine here. There was non-explosive burning fluid, which I assume went from hot air furnaces. On the other hand, there were the services of a copper and a leecher for medical purposes. There were doorbells and Venetian blinds which were used. Now, as we pointed out yesterday in our little trip through downtown, I showed you the one remaining hospital, but there were numerous hospitals here in Petersburg. There was the Ladies' Hospital, which is the one we saw yesterday, the Confederate States Hospital, the Virginia Hospital, the North Carolina, the South Carolina, and the Georgia Hospital. And these were converted tobacco warehouses. Also out at the fairgrounds, which is western edge of town, at Poplar Lawn, there was a hospital there using the pavilions from the fairgrounds. There was Poplar Lawn Park, and all of these hospitals were furnished with gas lighting and reservoir water for Confederate soldiers. And Dr. John Herbert Claiborne, I mentioned earlier, was the chief surgeon in charge of all hospitals, and he said that in the spring of 1864, he had over 3,000 patients spread out throughout the city. Now, how did the war affect those in town? Of course, there was martial law, and obstructions were put in the Appomattox River to keep Union gunboats from coming up. There was just previous to the war, as the railroads came in to the town, there were different companies, and so they didn't necessarily connect with one another. The Weldon Railroad came up to Washington Street, which is the street right out here, probably about 4 blocks down. It came up and ended, and so anything that came up the Weldon Railroad then would have to be transported by, they call them omnibuses, they were just wagons, over to either the Richmond and Petersburg Railroad or the South Side or whatever. And so what they did in late August of 1861 was to build a connector line which ran down through the middle of Washington Street and then curved and cut around, and like I said, was right over here across from the parking lot here, ran right in front of the YMCA, and was there up until about 4 or 5 years ago. When troops passed through the city, citizens showered the soldiers with flowers, fruit, food. The city also had a number of refugees from areas under federal control. But by December of 1862, it is said that 2/3 of the retail merchants had sold out of their stocks and were closed. In the fall of 1863, they began to feel the economic pinch here in Petersburg. These are some of the prices. Candy was 25 cents a pound. Now remember, whenever I use a price, I'm referring to Confederate money. Candy, which had been 25 cents a pound, was now 37 cents. Boys' shoes were $8 a pair. Salt was $40 a sack. Of course, salt, very important to folks back then because they needed it for their meat. Whiskey, which had been 25 cents a gallon, was now $4. By 1864, flour was between $190 and $200. Molasses was $25 a gallon, butter $6 a pound, and lard $4 a pound. After the Peninsula Campaign, and of course, fighting at Malvern Hill could be heard here, and you saw Malvern Hill yesterday when we were at City Point. That is when Captain Charles H. DeMott built the defensive system we saw yesterday of earthworks 10 miles long around the city, and they had the 55 batteries, which enclosed 352 Confederate artillery pieces. By late summer 1863, we had the formation of the City Battalion of Reserves. Towards the evening yesterday, we saw the site of the June 9, 1864 Old Men and Young Boys attack on the city by cavalry under General August Cockade. Now, once the siege actually began, the The shelling of the city was generally just on the eastern environs, just right in this area here. And in fact, the church that I pointed out to you yesterday across from Lee's headquarters on High Street, that is about as far as a shell would reach. And Charles Campbell, in his diary, he was a teacher at Anderson Seminary here, said he cleared out his coal cellar, spread rugs on the floor, and furnished it with lounges and chairs to use as a bomb shelter. Other piled bags of sand or cotton bales around their houses. Some families dug holes in their backyard, 5 to 6 feet deep, covered with heavy timber, banked over with dirt, and the entrance facing opposite the way the batteries would be shelling Petersburg. But all in all, less than a half a dozen civilians were killed by artillery fire during the siege. And of those, the majority were blacks who stayed behind to watch the property of their masters. Now the gas plant behind us here was struck by no less than 65 shells. Of course, it had a chimney on it, and that was what they were firing at. And more than 800 houses were hit in the city. But this proved to even have a little bit of a positive thing for the locals, in that Confederate authorities would gather these projectiles, and soldiers and civilians were paid 8 cents per pound for the cast iron that they could collect, and 20 cents for the lead. A Private Reamy of Company B, 34th Virginia, alone collected 1,567 mini balls, 2 round shot, and 2 shells, and consequently he got a furlough for that, a day for so many shells, how that worked. Now, the living conditions, depending on who you read, I know those who saw the movie at the Siege Museum with Joseph Cotton probably got the impression that the people in Petersburg were eating rats maybe, and that starvation ball was because there was no food. Well, that all comes from Sarah Pryor's reminiscences. But whoever wrote the script for that thing didn't read the whole book, because she emphatically says this. She says, with all our starvation, we never ate rats, mice, or mule meat. She said, we existed on peas, bread, and sorghum. Never had Petersburg been so healthy. Every particle of food was consumed and streets were clean. She said about the only thing that they ate out of the ordinary was pigeons. Well, a lot of people go dove hunting around here. I guess it's pigeon and doves are about the same thing. In fact, a Union soldier who had been taken prisoner at Ream Station and was being marched through the town noted the flower patches were nicely cultivated in front of the houses, and the canary birds were hung in cages before the doors. Now, Sarah Pryor did mention that flour was now $1,500 per barrel, bacon $20 a pound, beef $20 per pound, and chicken $50. But of course, by this time, you're into your final issue of Confederate money, the February of 1864, which was pretty much worthless. And she said that starvation parties were called that because of, on account of the absence of refreshments, which were impossible to obtain, not food. Yesterday when we were at the little Union encampment, and I pointed out a building there, and I said, you know, this is the PX, and I said, why didn't the Confederate soldiers have it? And I mentioned that they would come into town. I found this letter of William McFall, the Palmetto sharpshooters. This is written from Petersburg. He visits the town on September 4th, 1864. It says, when I arrived on the top of the Petersburg Heights, which is over there where Blandford Church is, who should I find out there in so dangerous a position at that hour of night? Why, it was a party of young ladies and gentlemen from the city out on a pleasure excursion. They appeared to be enjoying themselves finely, as if there was no danger at hand at all. They were chatting, laughing, talking, and passing off time finely, and the shells just flying over their heads. I then came on a large dwelling. There was a large party of gentlemen and ladies collected there, singing, playing on the piano, enjoying themselves as all was right and no danger at hand. On the streets, there were brass bands out serenading, and every yard seemed to be full of young ladies and gentlemen, all seeming to be enjoying themselves finely. Then he goes on to say, he said, everything looks as gay as ever. Everybody seems to be in the best of spirits. The dry goods stores all seem to be full of calico, muslin, ribbons, silks, jewelry, and etc. All kinds of young little things. Everything is prospering in the city. There's plenty of everything to eat in the market, but extremely high. In the market, you can see a little of everything for sale mixed up in stalls in all kinds of fashions. All kinds of people are to be seen there at this market daily. Now, another lady who lived here during the siege, she goes on to say in March of 1865, she says we can buy chickens, eggs, vegetables. She describes her dinner. She said we ate tender beef in abundance, delicious tomatoes, and bread made from homemade brown meal and apple roll. She also said that a small piece of desiccated vegetable, an inch square, imported from France for the army, with some bacon to boil, made a pot of good soup. She also said that they would make Confederate candles here. Now, a Confederate candle was, you would draw a cotton rope through melted wax and then wind it around a bottle. Another person living here said that the diet was simplified. Cornbread, dried peas, molasses, and sweet potatoes. All of these things, these dinners, they sound like just about what I ate at my in-laws at Appomattox every day. Sunday dinner was Irish potatoes, cornbread, coffee made of sweet potatoes and sweetened with sorghum, dried apples, and a slice of bacon. So that's what they were eating. Now, General Lee, of course, in Petersburg, he arrived here on June 18th, as I mentioned. Charles Campbell saw him as he rode into Petersburg and described him as this. He said he was large, portly, plainly dressed, gray coat, long white hair and whiskers, a large head. He said, reminded me every way of my idea of Washington. Now, Robert E. Lee, in staying here at Petersburg, as I pointed out, at least I pointed out the steeple, mainly worshipped at St. Paul's Episcopal Church. This is where General Pickett married his wife on September 15th, 1863, and then after the war, Robert E. Lee's son came back to marry a local girl, Mary Tabb Bowling, in 1867. If you recall, Rooney Lee's wife died first wife died during the war, and this was his second wife, and this was the only other time that Lee would come to Petersburg after the war. In fact, he stayed with General Mahone, whose house was now on Sycamore Street. One of those in the church said that they recalled his, meaning Lee's, erect figure as he walked up the aisle, accompanied by his adjutant general, Colonel Walter Taylor, every inch a soldier, yet how humbly he walked with his guide. And as I mentioned yesterday, even today, that seat that he always sat in is now marked in the church. In November 1st, 1864, Lee moved from the north side of the river, where he had his headquarters at Violet Bank, to High Street in Petersburg. That's the house I showed you. Colonel Taylor wrote in his book, he said, I selected a place where I thought he could be comfortable. I took possession of a vacant house and had his room prepared with a cheerful fire and everything made as cozy as possible. This is the first time we have been quartered in a house. I concluded to move headquarters on November 27th, as the party that proposed to occupy the house as soon as we should vacate had given a gentle hint by sending to inquire, quote, when General Lee would leave the house, unquote. And the only other house available was 2 miles to the west of the city. That was the Turnbull house called Edge Hill, and we'll see the site of that tomorrow on our way out. So they ran General Lee off my street. One lady who did live on High Street said that when Lee had his headquarters there, that she said that every time she saw Lee, he looked sad and rode with downcast head up and down High Street as he headed out to the line. A few years ago, I had a visitor come in. This fellow said, My great-grandfather was one of the Union troops that entered Petersburg, and he said he took some things as a souvenir, and he brought them out and said, one of the things I have is this newspaper, April 1st, 1865. And to find a newspaper of that being published in Petersburg and that late was quite a find. And of course, the front part of it had all about the battles that are taking place out in Dinwiddie County, Battle of Quaker Road, White Oak Road. Of course, Five Forks hadn't been reported in. Of course, they were all great Confederate victories, when in reality they were not. But what I found most interesting is when I flipped it over and started reading want ads. They were getting ready to start a girls' boarding school on April 3rd in the city. I mean, life it was going on as normal. I doubt if that school got started, since that's the day the city fell, but one of the ads had this: just received coffee, sugar, butter, lard, soda, pepper, sorghum molasses, family flour, buckwheat flour, meal, tallow candles, sperm candles, assortment of soaps, cigars, and different brands of tobacco. Also superior old apple brandy, fine old Southampton brandy, and superior old whiskey. So they were getting stuff in up to the very end. And there were other ads like that for these commercial merchants. But I think probably the most interesting thing that was in there was an ad that says, all colored men who will come forward and show their willingness to serve their country will receive $100 bounty. It says, notice, the undersigned have been ordered by General Lee to establish a recruiting office in this city under the terms of General Orders Number 14. The commanding general deems the prompt organization of a large force of Negroes as can be spared, a measure of the utmost importance, and the support and cooperation of the citizens of Petersburg and the surrounding counties is requested by him for the prosecution to success of a scheme which he believes promises so great benefit to our cause. And so this was the recruitment of black troops in the Confederacy. It went on to say, to the slaves is offered freedom and undisturbed residences at their own homes in the Confederacy after the war. Not the freedom of suffrage, but honorable and self-won by gallantry and devotion, which grateful countrymen will never cease to remember and reward. And for those who didn't hear a little discussion yesterday on this, I have been able to pretty much prove that the two companies, I guess is what they would be called, of black Confederate troops that were formed in Richmond, which is what this is all about, did leave with the Confederate Army when it withdrew from Richmond under General Buell. They were guarding Custis Lee's wagon train. They were wearing Confederate uniforms and were armed with muskets. And in a skirmish at Paineville, when that wagon train was captured, they were captured also, and apparently fired a couple of shots. Now, as far as the fall of Petersburg, Sarah Pryor says that she had on that day, this is April 3rd, a dinner of peas, potatoes, dried fruit, hominy, and bacon. And at 4:30 a.m., the city was officially surrendered to Colonel Ralph Ely of the 9th Army Corps. And again, those who went to the Siege Museum, the Confederate flag in the back of the museum there, it's mainly it's the Second National. It's the white one with the Confederate flag in the corner. That was the one that Ely took off the courthouse. Eventually, would return it to the city. Now, this is the message that was sent to him by the mayor, and this is what officially surrendered Petersburg. Quote, the city of Petersburg, having been evacuated by Confederate troops, we, a committee authorized by the Common Council, do hereby surrender the city to the United States forces with a request for protection of persons and property of its inhabitants. We are respectfully your obedient servant, W.W. Towns, Mayor. Now the courthouse, and the building with the clock on it, that whole building, steeple and all, was soon festooned with small federal flags. The citizens were required to report to the provost marshal and resume their allegiance. The 1st Michigan Sharpshooters and the 2nd Michigan Infantry were the first to raise their colors over the city. Almost immediately, rations were given out by these occupation troops: fresh meat, coffee, sugar, and canned vegetables to the local citizens. There would be soon a revival of business in Petersburg. The stocks generally displayed consisted of sutler goods, mostly edibles. A local citizen said this: "Some enjoy themselves by having lemonade," while one wrote, "I had a cow and furnished the milk. A neighbor brought coconut, and we had coconut ice cream sweetened with white sugar." Also, some of Grant's men who had been publishers, newspaper publishers at that time, took over the local printing press and published Grant's Petersburg Progress on April 3rd. And it had across the borderline, the headline, it says, "Eternal vigilance is the price of liberty at 10 cents a copy for our paper." And Len knows that when the Union Army attacked, or when the Union Army occupied Danville, they did the same thing. And so that seemed to be quite common. And so the war ended in Petersburg. A week later, of course, the surrender takes place at Appomattox. Many of the veterans there will soon come back, walking back to Petersburg here. And Petersburg will continue to go on. Now, Petersburg today pretty much, well, relied on its post-war economics, which was cotton, tobacco, railroad, related ironworks, and of course most of those have gone by the wayside, and the economy of Petersburg is not as healthy as it once was. And we had General Mahone's consolidation of the rail lines that I spoke about yesterday, Norfolk and Petersburg, the south side in Virginia and Tennessee. World War I, we had Camp Lee, and then the nearby DuPont plant at Hopewell, City Point, brought prosperity to the area. During World War II, it became Fort Lee, the Quartermaster Corps. And so that by now, in the 1980s, 1990s, the population is somewhere around 40,000 people, 72% black, the other percent white, 2% of that other. The main employer is the federal government, not the National Park Service, of course, but Fort Lee. But even in the times that I've been here, I've seen some of the economic losses, the main one being the railroad down near Fort Wadsworth. I understand a large group went down there today and went underneath the big railroad yard there. Well, that closed down recently, but probably the biggest devastating factor was about 6 or 7 years ago, Brown & Williamson Tobacco pulled out, and that was the biggest employer here in Petersburg, and went to Macon, Georgia, I believe. So now what we are left with is probably the second largest industry in this state, and one that I'm heavily involved with, and probably is the major potential of this town. We're working on it. Unfortunately, we had a natural disaster about 3 years ago that set us way back in the form of a tornado that went right through the historic part of downtown. But that industry is tourism. You folks are great help to us here. But I'd like to end with a little quote that I found that I think pretty much sums up our situation today. It says that Petersburg is a town dominated by its past. Like Williamsburg, it seems destined to live in the shadow of its glorious memories. Thank you.
Yeah, with the add to the recruitment of these colored troops,
Yeah.
why would that be put in a newspaper? That assumes a certain level of literacy among both the slaves and the free blacks that I didn't think.
Well, I think it's probably more centered towards the slave owners to get their slaves to be brought in. See, like they rented their slaves to the Confederacy for building the DeMont line was built by slave labor, and of course the free blacks were also employed in that purpose. But I think it was more written towards the slave owners to, coerce whatever their slaves to join the
they going to be compensated for that or in any way? Is there any indication of the bounty from the owners?
What did he say? I think he said something, money figure. It says, all colored men, will receive $100 bounty in Confederate money.
Am I correct that there's at least one colored musician listed on the Appomattox wall?
Oh, yeah. Now those, there are numerous ones. Those belong to an elite unit from Savannah, Georgia, called the Savannah Guards. And they, in fact, that was a recent subject of a painting. I worked with artist Keith Rocco, and those of you who are into the paintings might be familiar with it. It's what the title of it is, Victory or Death, which is what they had on their flag. And they went into the Battle of Sailor's Creek and were virtually wiped out. But their musicians got away. They were the ones who surrendered at Appomattox. And so I have them listed also in this story. But the two references I have, or the three references I have, two of them are Confederate soldiers who witnessed the black troops. And one of them says that, let's see, the two companies, one was commanded by an officer by the name of Turner, and I believe the other one was Foster. I might be wrong on Foster, but I know Turner was one of them. And he comes across this wagon train as it's being attacked, and he sees these troops and they're firing their muskets and all, and he says these are the recently recruited troops, Captain Foster, whatever. And then the other one is just another Confederate soldier who says it's the first time I've seen black troops, and blah, blah, blah. And then the third reference I found was actually a letter of a chaplain in the 50th Pennsylvania. That was a diary that was published many years ago. And he is guarding the South Side Railroad, and the prisoners from Sailor's Creek are marching by, and he describes them as they go by, and he says, with them are a group of colored soldiers that had recently been armed by Jeff Davis. So that's where it came from. But I know most of, of course, that's a big thing now. Is there's been, I don't know how many books have come out about black Confederate soldiers, but so far most of them always say that they never saw combat.
So Steph Urban Jordan says in this book that there were 2 black regiments in the First Manassas.
Yeah, no, I don't know any. All the early stuff, I can't go into it, but this I do know. The Richmond Choir or whatever talks about the ones that were recruited at the very end.
This is a little bit off the subject of your talk, but is there any record of any kind, any information about contact between free blacks and slave blacks?
Well, okay, in this community, the free blacks lived in suburbs, and you're right in the middle of, right across 95 there is the suburb of or what had been the suburb of Blandford. That was a free black community. And then when we were down by the South Side Railroad station yesterday, on the other side of the railroad, or the Pocahontas Bridge, is a community called Pocahontas, and that was a free black community. It was the north side of the river, but when they diverted the channel of the Appomattox River there, it's now an island, and that whole community was just totally wiped off the map by the tornado. I mean, all of their buildings, everything, and I know there was quite a bit of publicity about that. The free blacks, I guess, stayed in there. The slaves that I find in Petersburg, you don't either tend to work at the factories, mainly the tobacco factories. It seems like the women worked in the cotton mills, and the slaves or the free blacks worked at the other factories. I know in my house, the fellow owned 6 slaves, and the quarters are still there, but they were, one of them was domestic and the others worked for he was a carpenter and a contractor, and they worked for him there. She didn't have a lot of slaves here in the city. I think they were mainly out.
Chris, what do you think if you walked downtown Petersburg in that era, what do you think the mix might have been during ordinary business days between black and white?
Just like it is today. And I'll tell you why. I have, when, in one of my books, I don't know, I think it was Farm Bivouac or whatever, I have some quotes and things like that of the Union troops coming back from Appomattox and going through Petersburg on their way to Richmond, and then from Richmond on up to Washington to be mustered out. And of their description of Petersburg, which I won't use the term they used, but they said it was full of, even at that time, it was almost 50-50. And in fact, one of the little sidebars I used in my book was I took the 1860 census and showed that almost all of this area that we're going to go through tomorrow was at least 50-50. See, this is called, Southern Virginia is called the Black Belt of Virginia, because this is where most of the plantations were, the large plantations. This is where tobacco is grown, and labor-intensive crops. And so I would think Richmond is a majority-minority, Petersburg's a majority-minority, Farmville, all the city, all little towns through Southside Virginia are like that because, of course, after the war, after emancipation, many of them just left and came to the cities. And in fact, Danville was another one, in the one book where I talk about the occupation of Danville. It was such a problem because there was this immediate emancipation of the slave, and no one knew what to do. There was no guidance, and of course with the martial law and all, they were trying to tell them, look, you now have to work, you now have to work out something with your former masters, go back to the farm, don't come to the city, there's nothing here for you to do. So it was a big problem at that time in the immediate post-war.
Just getting back to that recruitment ad, it seems to me from the way you read it that it implied very strongly that there was no permission needed from the masters. That any slave, it could be an escaped slave or a slave that was working in a house, could just walk off and enlist, get $100, and be free. And that seems to me like breathtakingly revolutionary. What I understand about the Confederacy and property rights, what they were fighting for, that now the government's announcing that your slave can just walk out the door and enlist, get $100, and he's free, and no recourse to you.
Well,
unless I'm reading it wrong.
That's not the interpretation. I mean, the master's property rights have to be respected. As you're rightly saying, Chris, it's an appeal for the masters to allow your slaves to go into service, and an appeal to free blacks of their own will.
Yeah. In fact, we have some of the receipts that were given to the masters for renting, and they rented them as far away as Appomattox County, renting them to the Confederacy to build these earthworks around here. But there was also another big, in September of 1864, Lee made a call for slaves to be brought in to help with the earthworks, and it wasn't, correct me if I'm wrong, but it's February of '65 that they finally decide in the Confederacy that they're going to recruit blacks. I think it doesn't, it's a very controversial issue, but at this point, manpower shortages are just so bad.
Any more questions? Thanks very much.